My name is Kiara Perez, and the topic we'll be talking about today is Fragile X syndrome. However, before we get started, I want to talk about the background of it all. What are some of the signs and symptoms? How does it occur? What is Fragile X syndrome? To put it in simple terms, Fragile X syndrome is a genetic condition that is inherited on the X chromosome, which can occur in both females and males. A genetic condition is caused by a part or a whole by a change in a DNA sequence. There's a fragile site and break at the bottom of the X chromosome that looks like a gap. This is what it's called, a fragile site. An X chromosome is one of the two types of sex chromosomes, XX for females, XY for males. This is most likely to occur in males than females, however. Sadly, there's no cure, but interventions can occur early in the stages as well as therapy for someone who will be diagnosed or was diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome. It's also one of the most leading causes of intellectual disabilities and cognitive impairment. So what are some of the signs and symptoms one can have with Fragile X syndrome? Well, some of these signs and symptoms can vary among individuals, meaning not everyone with this syndrome may possess these symptoms, which can include the following: a prominent jaw, long face, large ears, enlargement of the feet, low muscle tones, as well as macrogynism in males, basically meaning that they have the enlargement of the testes before puberty. Both females and males can have developmental delays, which can include not walking, not talking, or not crawling around the same age as individuals. They can also have behavior issues, anxiety, hand flapping, sensory disorders. They're sensible to light, hearing, and touch. I also want to make a quick note that many times in the case of Fragile X syndrome, they can often get mistaken for autism disorder because they often link up. They have some of the same signs and symptoms. So, how does and where does Fragile X syndrome occur? Well, Fragile X syndrome is passed down from parent to child due to inheritance, which I will talk about later in the following slides. Fragile X syndrome occurs on the X chromosome. So as we see, it's showing a normal X chromosome in this picture as well as a fragile X chromosome. At the very bottom of that fragile X chromosome, like we said earlier, there's the fragile site. A gap is created. That fragile site is because of a mutation that occurs in the FMR1 gene. FMR1 stands for Fragile Mental Retardation 1. It's a human gene that codes for a protein necessary for the brain's development. This mutation that happened is because of a DNA segment, CGG, which is repeated over 200 times, which is totally abnormal. This completely turns off that FMR1 gene. In the normal repetition, it will have at least a 5 to 40 repetition. However, in this case, that's not exactly what occurred. So, before we get into the inheritance of Fragile X syndrome, it's important to talk about the chromosome structure of Fragile X syndrome. There's two chromosome structures that I want to talk about. Fragile X syndrome has a duplication and a deletion. A duplication is basically a segment that's being repeated. In the case of the syndrome, the segment CGG is repeating over 200 times. Like I said earlier, this is actually very abnormal. This causes a deletion in the FMR1 gene. When this FMR1 gene is deleted, that means it's no longer producing that protein needed for the brain's cognitive development. That protein is called FMRP, Fragile Mental Retardation Protein. If somebody's actually considered gene pre-mutation, they will have at least a 55 to 200 repeats of that segment, making them prone for that mutation. However, they won't be considered having that fully mutated gene. They will be considered carriers. So, now that we know more about the chromosome structure, let's get into the inheritance. How is this inherited? Where is this inherited? Well, Fragile X syndrome is inherited in the X-linked dominant manner. So, what do I mean by this? Well, X-linked basically means that if the disorder happens on the X chromosome, it's considered X-linked. It is considered dominant because one of the two altered genes in each cell shows the condition. However, females can only inherit this gene from their mother and father. But it's complete opposite for males. They can only inherit from their mother. So, females can only inherit this gene from their mother and father. Fathers can pass down the premutation form of the gene, FR1, to their daughters. Another simple way to actually see if an offspring can have this inheritance, it's a Punnett square. It's something very easy. A Punnett square can show the offspring. In this case right here in the picture above, it shows the Punnett square, a box with 400 boxes, showing an example of a fully mutated mother and a normal father. They both have a 25% chance of having a daughter with this syndrome as well as a son. But also keep in mind, which I will talk about this actually in the following 2 slides, that a daughter, even though she has a mutated gene for this, does not mean she will actually have the syndrome. So, how is FXS inherited in males? Simple. A male has one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. It makes it more susceptible for disorders to be caused by the genes on the X. What I mean by this is since a male has only one X chromosome, they can't really fall back on that Y chromosome like a female can. A female can have a fully mutated X chromosome of that particular syndrome, but they can kind of fall back on that other X chromosome to kind of outbalance it off. A male gets FXS when he inherits the X with an FMR1 mutation from his mother. The mother is considered a carrier, which means she carries a mutation, but she does not have a disorder. A male could also get FXS when the X from his mother carries a premutation in the gene. So remember when I told you to keep in mind that even though a daughter can have that fully mutated mutation of the syndrome, she may not actually have the syndrome at all. This is due to the fact of X inactivation. X activation is actually a normal process in all females. It ensures that females, like males, have one copy of the X that is fully mutated in each body cell. The chromosomes shrivel up, which can no longer produce proteins. So that's why it's important to keep in mind that even though a female may have a fully mutated gene, it doesn't particularly mean she will have this syndrome, or maybe she will have a less severe symptoms of this syndrome. So now that we have a better understanding of X inactivation, how Fragile X syndrome happens and how it occurs, we can kind of see how it's been advancing in the world of biology. Sadly, there hasn't been any treatments or cures yet, but there has been something that researchers and scientists were able to detect and discover. Using positive Fragile X syndrome human embryos, scientists were able to discover that early in fetal development, RNA was binding onto FX genes' DNA. If you don't know what RNA is, it's basically your messenger for DNAs. So when researchers found this out, they use a compound that binds to CGG, again that same segment that we've seen in Fragile X syndrome, in the gene's RNA. This led to the discovery that the protein FMRP never actually stopped producing, which is a very great thing that they figured out, because that meant if pregnant women would be allowed for treatment if they were told they were carrying a fetus with FXS genetic mutation. So later on, if in the years coming, if this treatment does get to work, they will be injected with this during the digestion time. So, after all this, why did I choose this topic? Why did I choose Fragile X syndrome out of all the syndromes out there, conditions, and disorders? Well, even though in most cases it's mostly dealt with cognitive impairment and intellectual disabilities, it's actually not commonly known. Like I said earlier, there are many cases that autism spectrum disorders are blamed, but it's actually Fragile X syndrome that's occurring in individuals, which is very sad because it can be very misleading not knowing what you actually have. I want to spread awareness in order to help somebody who has a kid or they actually have it to get treatment and therapy in the early stages, allowing them to actually live a fully normal life because they can. The life expectancy is generally normal. So why should this take a toll on somebody when it's a perfectly something normal that they can live with? So yes, even though it is a genetic syndrome, it doesn't mean it should take a toll on somebody's life.